So I'm going to teach you about history, which is a pretty broad topic. So I'll just go over what history technically means. First, we gotta know what BC and AD stand for. BC stands for birth of Christ, but AD does not stand for after death, because that would make years when Christ was alive not count. So that wouldn't make any sense. AD actually stands for ad domini, this word, which stands for the year of our Lord. If you don't believe in Christ, you could just put BCE or CE, which stands for before Common Era and Common Era, respectively. So what exactly would history even mean? Well, technically, history is anything that happens after writing was invented in 7000 BCE. Anything before that is defined as prehistoric. Now, there are three major periods of history. The first period is the ancient or classical period, which lasts from 7000 BCE to 496 AD. 496 AD is when Rome finally falls, and that starts the second major period of history, the medieval period. This period ends with the Renaissance in 1300 AD. And lastly, we got the third period, which is the modern era, which is still going on today. With all the new technology that's coming out, some people believe we're living in a postmodern era. One word is really important to this history class: paradigm, which means the way of thinking. History is all about these paradigm shifts. That's how history progresses. So one of the most important paradigm shifts in history, well, let me tell you a story. After the fall of Rome, there was this dude named Charlemagne who converted the Holy Roman Empire into Christianity and kind of unified all of the pieces of the Holy Roman Empire. But then, on Christmas Day, the Pope rewards Charlemagne with the crown to the Holy Roman Empire. This is huge. Charlemagne was the leader of the state, while the Pope was the leader of the church. So this effectively combined church and state and led to the beginning of the Dark Ages, where theology was on the rise and science, well, it just got thrown out the window. And in the mid-1300s, the Renaissance disproved notions that the Earth was at the center of the universe and whatnot. People like Galileo, Da Vinci, Copernicus, they gave birth to the scientific method. So then there was this dude named Martin Luther who didn't really like the Bible's monopoly on everything. You see, the Bible was entirely written in Latin, so a lot of people couldn't understand it. So Martin Luther translated the Bible into vernacular or popular language and started the Protestant Reformation. And here is a huge paradigm shift from the 1600s to 1700s. It's called the Enlightenment. This led to the origins of modern democracy, which is really important if you want to study history of the Americas or just history in general. See, at the beginning of human history, the leaders were kind of seen as divine beings. So they have like a divine right to rule and all of that. So there's this philosopher named Thomas Hobbes, and he wrote a book called The Leviathan, and Leviathan was just a huge monster that represented the government, in which people sacrificed their freedom for security. This led to the rise of dictatorships and monarchies, which are called authoritarian governments. Authoritarian is a word that you need to remember. And there was another philosopher named John Locke, who believed in more democratic philosophies. I'll get back to that later. And there was another philosopher named Montesquieu. I'll put the name up there because it's right there. And he kind of invented the checks and balances system that the US still has today: executive, legislative, judicial. And finally, the philosopher Rousseau believed that in order for democracy to work, individuals must put the good of the whole over the good of the individual. Alright, so here's a story. In the 1200s, there were two kings, Richard I, who was super popular in England, and John I, who ruled with an iron fist. Then the Pope gives Richard I a call. He's like, "Hey, can you help with the Crusades?" And Richard's like, "Sure." And then Richard just comes over and fights. Then John I takes over. John I started taxing the heck out of everyone, and people protested that. Then a bunch of nobles invited him to go hunting, and then threatened him with knives to sign a document called the Magna Carta of 1215. This basically gave the population more rights and limited John's rights. For example, let me see this. No taxes without the consent of nobles, and no one shall be imprisoned without trial and conviction by a jury of peers, which is the basis of English common law. Why did I make notes like this? Are you seeing this? I mean, how in the world am I supposed to read this? Apparently it says there are 5 important dates you need to know. William the Conqueror sails from Normandy to England in 1066 and brings the Anglo-Saxons, or the modern-day British, and completely changes the English language. As you know, 1215 was when the Magna Carta was signed. Then there was 1453, which is the fall of Constantinople, which was the bridge from Europe to Asia, so it was pretty darn important. Then 1492, Christopher Columbus discovers the New World, except he wasn't really the only one to prove that the earth was round, blah 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 blah. He was a terrible person. And in 1517 was when Martin Luther kind of started the Protestant Reformation. He was insulted by Henry VIII, who later formed the Anglican Church. I have to go through this whole story? Here we go. So, Henry VIII had a brother named Arthur who would have been king, but he died. Arthur married Catherine, which was a child of the Spanish throne, and later dies. Henry VIII inherits Catherine's marriage and informs the Pope. Hey, there's good news, you got a child. Bad news, it's a daughter. Henry VIII does not want a daughter, he wants a son, so that son could be king. He wanted a king, not a queen. So Henry goes up to the Pope and he's like, I want a divorce! And the Pope's like, ha 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 ha! You serious? So then Henry decides to make his own church. Then Henry locks up Catherine, marries her maid, who's named Anne Boleyn. I think some of you might have heard of her. And then Anne produces another daughter. And then Anne is accused of having an affair. And, yep, Anne gets beheaded. Henry VIII then marries Jane Seymour, and then gives birth to a son named Edward, and Jane died in childbirth. Edward became the king at 10 years old, which is really weird, and he died at 16 years old. And Mary became heir to the throne, and she remained Catholic, killing Anglican officials. That is why she is called Bloody Mary. Then Queen Elizabeth became the heir, and she was a Protestant. Then she beheaded Catholic officials. She had no children, and she ruled from 1560 to 1603, which is the 3rd longest in history. Elizabeth's heir to the throne was James I. We'll get to that later. While Elizabeth was the ruler, Sir Francis Drake robbed Spanish ships, and the Spanish king demanded punishment, and Elizabeth knighted Drake. And then Spain declared war. Catholics versus Protestants. The Spanish Armada versus the English ships. Then there was a huge thunderstorm that wiped out a third of the Armada. The other 2/3 was outmaneuvered by smaller English ships. And England defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. Now they have control of the seas, and they started an empire. Which means it's colony time. They make the first permanent colony, Jamestown. Remember James I? That's what it's named after. They made that in 1607. And by the way, James I's heir was Charles I. That's not just a fun fact. You really need to know this for this history lesson. So Charles I, he kept urging Parliament to pass some taxes. Parliament keeps rejecting. He rejected one offer. So Charles just goes to Parliament and absolutely dissolves it. Then Parliament had a re-election, and they voted no, and they dissolved. So they had another re-election. This time, this led to the English Civil War in 1642 to 49. Civil War was between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. And the winner was the Roundheads. So Charles I, he was forced to sign a peace document, but he refused. So he was promptly executed and eviscerated. By the way, Charles I married a French princess named Henrietta, and she was Catholic. People hated this, so they formed the Pilgrims, which were the Separatists, and the Puritans, and they formed their own church, and yeah, that kind of led to the migration to the Northeast U.S. Are you kidding me? I have to do another one of those? Look at this. Can you understand any of this? That's what I thought. I mean, come on. So the new government that was created was called the Protectorate, or the Interregnum, which lasted 10 years. Dominated by Puritans, it was super strict, and Cromwell was brutal towards Ireland, and kind of saw this as a crusade to convert the Irish to Anglican. Cromwell later died in 1659. His son took over, ruled for less than a year. Charles II became the ruler of England until 1687, which is a really important year. You see, Mary was married to William of Orange, who was a Catholic and would support an army against King James II and supported Parliament getting more power. They supported the invasion of their own monarch. This became known as the Glorious Revolution. So in 1730, since the Parliament has all that power, they passed the Navigation Acts, which means the colonies can only trade with the British Empire. So the colonists kept defying this, they traded with other countries, and then the British governor of Virginia discovered French Fort Duquesne on Virginia soil in the Ohio wilderness, and so that kind of started the French and Indian War. Also known as the 7 Years' War, it became a world war and lasted more than 7 years, from 1754 to 63. The new Prime Minister of England, William Pitt, he led England to victory. That's where you get the name Pittsburgh, from Fort Pitt, which was formerly Fort Duquesne. France left all of its possessions to England, except for Quebec. England was really nice and let the French have Quebec. So now England is now really broke. The British colonies were super rich, but they did not exclusively trade with the motherland, which broke a rule called mercantilism, which means the colonial power has all control over the colony. So Britain started taxing the colonies. The colonists felt that this was unfair because they didn't have any representation in Parliament, and that kind of led to the American Revolution. On July 4th, 1776, you already know the Declaration of Independence was founded with John Locke philosophies, which were, as I told you earlier, pretty democratic. It was a legal argument for the world, and the colonists blamed King George III. The Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, the main writer, he thought about blaming slavery on the king, but the South was like, no, we need that slavery. So they decided to disregard that. At the end of the Revolution, the Continental Congress became a representative government instead of a parliament or a monarchy, which is huge. This is a confederate government in which the states hold hegemony instead of a unitary government in which all the local governments are tied to the central government. This Confederate government was the first government of the U.S. under the Articles of Confederation, which lasted for 6 years. And the flaws were shown by Shays' Rebellion, and it was kind of seen as a mobocracy. So, see, every state must agree to pass a law. It was really complicated. So then in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in 1787, the states sent 55 delegates to revise the Articles of Confederation. This is known as the Constitutional Convention, and the Constitution was finished in 1787, ratified in 1789. Also, all interstate trade was governed by Congress, all intrastate trade was governed by the state, which was pretty darn important if you want to avoid a mobocracy. This led to the creation of a federal government in which the local and central governments share power. It was also bicameral, which had a two-house system. It had the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives was based off of population. The Senate has 2 representatives per state. So next time you think about making a government, remember, it's a lot harder than it looks. This has been Harper Cates, and I will see you next time.
Which subject are we gonna teach next?
Spin the wheel to find out. Next time on Project E!